All day the stars watch from long ago. My mother said, I am going now. When you are alone, you will be all right. Whether or not you know, you will know. Look at the old house in the dawn rain. All the flowers are forms of water. The sun reminds them through a white cloud, touches the patchwork spread on the hill, the washed colors of the afterlife that lived there long before you were born. See how they wake without a question, even though the whole world is burning.
That's one of Maui's most honored residents reading his work. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, W.S. Merwin. Yes, a major American writer whose poems, prose, and translations have brought him international literary standing. He's lived in Haiku, Maui since the late 1970s. W.S. Merwin, or William as his friends call him, next on Long Story Short.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, produced with Sony Technology, is Hawaii's first weekly television program produced and broadcast in HD. High definition, it's in Sony's DNA.
Aloha mai kako, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Welcome to Long Story Short. From childhood, W.S. Merwin has loved the sound of words and putting them together. He's won nearly every major award for poetry in his 5 decades as a writer. Born in New York City, raised in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Merwin traveled widely before coming to Maui in the late 1970s to study Zen Buddhism. He built a house on old pineapple plantation land in Haiku, Maui, and found himself drawn to native Hawaiians, their culture and their causes. Words remain a constant in his life. In April 2009, he won his second Pulitzer Prize for poetry for his 21st book, The Shadow of Sirius. I'm kind of daunted to be talking to a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Any advice for me? What annoys you when people, in terms of how people react to you as a poet and as a Pulitzer winner?
Well, I don't think of myself that way at all, obviously. I mean, it would be pretty silly, wouldn't it, if I walked around thinking, I'm this and I'm that. All my life, and I wanted to write poetry since I was 5 years old, I've always thought when I got a poem to where I was ready to let it go, because I couldn't do any more to it or for it, I thought, well, I may never do that again, you know, it may never happen again. Because I don't think, for me, that it's an act of will or an act of reason or any of those things. Suddenly, I think to me it's something that you hear. I mean, suddenly there's a phrase or there's a moment in your life or something which brings up some words, something that have to do with that. And maybe words you've known all your life, but you never paid any attention to them. But all of a sudden, there they are, they're alive and they're going somewhere, and you listen to them. And I think that the whole secret of poetry is listening. And children know how to do this. Children start listening, you know, even before they know what words are, they're listening, they're paying attention. And then they learn to read, and then in our culture, they're discouraged from reciting poetry or from the pleasures of poetry, which they know all about when they're very small. And if they're lucky, they catch up with it again, and they realize that it's a matter of not of just understanding, it's a matter of hearing something. And it's a matter of pleasure. It should be pleasure, you know. And if, just as, and people say, "Oh, I can't do that." Well, you don't think about a rock lyric. You don't think about whether you understand it. If you like it, you remember it, and you find you're humming it in your head, you know, after a while, and you haven't thought about whether you understand it, or maybe you don't understand it. I mean, back in the days, long ago, when we all listened to Bob Dylan. I mean, the great lyrics of Bob Dylan and the Beatles, I don't think anybody was supposed to understand them, you know.
Somehow
what about
they
the Yellow
resonated.
Submarine? I mean, what is there understandable about a yellow
Or
submarine?
who was the Eggman?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I'm thinking of, my daughter wants to be an artist, and I think from the very beginning I said, well, make sure you can earn a living at it. Did you ever say, I want to be a poet, and a parent or someone else said to you, whoa?
Oh, they all said
practical.
that. They all said that. And I said, well, they said, what are you going to do to earn a living? And I said, well, I'll find out that as I go along, you know. But I didn't do it the other way around, you know. I think I'm going to have a career and then I'm going to write a little poetry in my spare time. I never thought of it that way. I thought, this is what I want to do with my life, and maybe I'll find some way to stay alive. And I lived on very little money for quite a few years. You know, a lot of artists in all the arts were that way until very recently. It was only in recent generations that people thought that the first thing was earning a living. And as long as you think that, I mean, as long as you think that, you're not going to do it. A friend of mine said, well, I really want to try to translate Hawaiian poetry. And I'm going to do it when I get a grant to do it. And I said, you're not going to do it. You don't care enough about it. He said, what do you mean? I said, you like surfing. And I said, if you want to go to surf in Australia or Bali, you find a way to get to Bali in Australia, and you go surfing. You don't worry about somebody giving you a grant to go surfing in Bali and Australia. You know, you get on with it. If you want to start translating Hawaiian poetry, which I think is pretty well impossible, you try. You get to work and you devote a lot of time to it, and you don't wait for somebody to subsidize you.
Why do you think it's impossible to translate Hawaiian poetry?
Because, in the first place, the melodic, the lyric aspect of the great chants is hana hana hanalei ika ua nui. I mean, how do you ever translate a line like that? It's so magnificent. But you can't, there's nothing, no way in English that you convey that sound. And then underneath, so much of Hawaiian poetry is the overtones, all of the things that it's referring to, all of the myths that it's referring to. I mean, if you look at a book of translations, of classical translations of Hawaiian poetry, about 3/4 of the page is footnotes, you know, to what all this really means. I mean, the rain always has an erotic meaning to it, and it has a reference to the place and that place in other legends. And if you don't know those things, you don't really know what the ole is about, you know.
You wrote an entire epic narrative of Hawaii, your adopted home.
That's right. Well, you know the story of Ko'olau and Pi'ilani. Ko'olau was famous as a young man. He was the best shot on the island, Kauai. His wife was considered very beautiful as a young woman. And Ko'olau was fingered with leprosy. It was at a time when they wouldn't let people with leprosy, they would ship them off to Kalaupapa, to the leprosy colony over there, and they wouldn't let anybody from their family go with them or even accompany them over there. So the Hawaiians' name for leprosy was the separating sickness, because it broke up the family. And of course, for Hawaiians, nothing could be worse than that, because the family unit is integral. And Ko'olau and Pi'ilani, they decided that they would not allow him to be arrested, and they were going to stay together. And they went over to Kalalau, to the valley on the north coast, where there were already a number of Hansen's disease patients staying to stay out of reach of the law. I mean, this was a very wild place, Kalalau, and there was one sheriff that wanted to capture him and make his political name doing that. And Ko'olau let it be known that they would not leave the valley alive. That meant, obviously, that anybody who came for them was risking his life too, you know. And the sheriff tried to get the jump on him, and Ko'olau killed him. And then, of course, they sent the army in after him, and they escaped. And I was absolutely fascinated by this story, and I suddenly realized that, you know, if someone were to want to write about this, I couldn't write the history. I'm not a historian. I can't write an essay about it. That's ridiculous. And so I just sort of carried it around, that story. And I suddenly thought, the only way it'll work is as a poem. And the only way it'll work as a poem is if the central figure is not even Ko'olau, it's Pi'ilani. It's a Hawaiian woman. This one night I just saw her starting out at night, going up the trail.
You saw her in your mind, it was a visual?
Yeah. And I started the poem about her just going up this trail and the whole of her journey up, and who she met and the places she went and so forth, until she went down and the whole story. And then from there to the whole history of Kauai, because it was, you know, you can't separate them to it. It's all the same story. And that was the poem.
It was a novel in verse called The Folding Cliffs. He was born William Stanley Merwin, and from an early age he had a fascination with the magic of words. In his home on Maui, he writes only in longhand, daily in a room with a view of the outdoors. Nature is an inspiration.
Can you tell me where you were and what you were doing when you heard your first poetry inside?
Well, you know, I was very lucky. This is another thing that a lot of children don't have. Maybe they never did, I don't know. But my mother read poems to my sister and me. Everything from silly childhood, you know, jingle poems, to Robert Louis Stevenson's Child's Garden of Verses. You know, Stevenson spent several years here in Hawaii on the way to the South Pacific.
Yes.
And I can remember her reading Tennyson's The Brook, and I loved that poem.
You loved it as a kid, too?
Yeah, even when I was a little boy, before I could even read. Some children are lucky and their parents read stories to them, and that's great. But prose and poetry are different, and hearing their parents read poetry is, I think, very important. My father was a minister. The sermons I didn't pay any attention to, but we had to go to church every Sunday and sometimes more often.
He was a Presbyterian minister, wasn't he?
Presbyterian minister, very strict Scotch Presbyterian. But he read the King James Version of the Bible, the Psalms and lots of the Old and New Testament. And that was the version that really seemed like magic to me. I mean, I really listened to that language, and I knew quite a lot of those passages by heart by the time when I grew up and moved away from the whole thing. But I still remembered that sound of hearing the Psalms and hearing the Proverbs and hearing the prophets and hearing the New Testament. And that's very valuable for children to hear that. And
so when you're writing, do you come at it from a place of joy?
yeah, I really love everything to do with poetry, and I feel very lucky if something ever begins to sort of happen, you know. There's a great French novelist, Flaubert, somebody asked him about inspiration, and he said, inspiration consists in sitting down at the same table at the same time every day. You know, the wandering around hoping to be struck by lightning, I mean, that doesn't make much sense. I mean, Keats, the sort of archetypal romantic of English poetry, very great poet, worked at it all the time. He tried very hard to write all the time.
And yet you say when it happens, it's an accident.
Sure, it is. Both of these things are true. When you look at dance, I mean, take ballet dance, for example, it looks effortless, doesn't it?
It does.
And
that's the point, isn't it?
And it's certainly not effortless. I mean, the effort that went into being able to do that. When you hear someone play Mozart or any instrument or whatever kind of music you like, a saxophone playing jazz and improvising, it looks effortless, doesn't it? It looks as though it happens
Yes.
all by itself. And you know perfectly well, It didn't happen all by itself. This is a whole lifetime that's gone into that. And I think that's true of any of the arts. The arts have to be sort of partly an obsession. You have to be
Partly an obsession.
A little bit obsessed to make it work. Look at the great surfers. Did they learn how to stand up on a surfboard with a big wave curling behind them all by themselves? It looks like the easiest thing in the world. At that point, it is the only possible thing to do. You know, if you change your mind, you'll wipe out right there.
And for years before, they've been on the alert for any bump in the surf, and they've been out there.
That's right.
After graduating from Princeton, W.S. Merwin began his literary career by translating works in Spanish, French, Italian, and Latin into English. He also worked as a private tutor to the son of famous author and poet Robert Graves. It was through Graves that Merwin met many other literary greats, such as T.S. Eliot. In 1952, when he was only 24 years old, he became a published author with a book of verse titled The Mask of Janus. He lived in England, Spain, France, and New York before settling in East Maui.
What brought you there? You'd lived in many parts of the world by then.
Yeah, I kept a little rent-controlled apartment in New York for many years, but I didn't want to live there all year round. I wanted to live there part of the year. And I came out to Hawaii, and I really fell in love with Hawaii. And I met Robert Aiken, who was the Zen teacher here, and I wanted to stay and spend more time with him. And little by little, the longer I stayed here, the more I wanted to stay.
Was it just the nature that drew you, or
It
what
was
other?
It was partially the feeling of the remains of an ancient culture, too, and of an ancient language and culture. And suddenly here were the real remnants of it. I mean, with the hula and the chants and the things like that, and the things that, everything about it fascinated me. And it was still related to a place. And you could see the place that it was related to. You know, I'm not a wannabe Hawaiian. I mean, that would be I think that would be very silly. But I had and still have enormous respect for everything to do with the Hawaiians.
You're a very successful poet, but what if you needed to pay the bills? You needed to publish poetry.
Could do something else? Then I would, you know.
You couldn't force poetry?
No, I would take on a prose writing job or go do some readings or something like that to pay the bills. I've had to do that all my life. I never expected to earn a lot of money, and I think that was true. That's been true of artists all through the years. I mean, there are very few for whom money was the first thing. I think there are usually quicker and faster ways of earning money than writing a symphony or writing a few poems or even writing a novel. I mean, a novel is a big. Sometimes you make it big with a novel, but most novelists have got 5 or 6 novels in the drawer that never even got published, you know.
Do you always pay attention to how many books are selling, how you're doing in the marketplace?
No, I mean, I'm a royalty return or something like that. You know, I look and see how they're doing, and then I put it in the file and forget about it. You know, I think, well, you know, sometimes I'm agreeably surprised, and books of poetry don't sell an awful lot.
You've won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry 38 years apart, and yet you've written more than 20 collections, more than 20 books. What was it, do you think, that won you those 2 Pulitzers for those specific books?
You know, I have no idea. I really don't. I don't know how people felt when they opened those books and read them, and what other books they were looking at that year that they were comparing them to, and all the deliberations that they went through, and what made them like that book more than another one. And a lot of it is not exactly politics, but it's chance. You know, it depends on what book came up the last time, and so on and so forth, and the shuffling of the cards. You know, I mean, there's part of it is chance in that sense. So I don't know, and I've never tried to double guess editors, I mean, if prizes come, I'm delighted. I'm always surprised. I'm very happy, and it's very nice. but I certainly don't spend my life thinking, I wonder if I might get to such and such as a thing or anything like that.
W.S. Merwin is also a pacifist, anti-imperialist, and an environmental activist. His poems are known for their awareness of the natural world, their intimate feelings for natural landscapes. But they're not always light and upbeat. Some of them are dark and foreboding.
You know, you seem like such a pleasant, jovial, happy person for having an apocalyptic view of the world as I read your poems.
I don't think these are incompatible. I'm at one level extremely pessimistic. And you don't want me to pursue that line of thought either, I don't think.
You're pessimistic about what humans do to nature.
That's
I know
right.
that. That's very clear.
Yeah. I don't think that we're separate from nature. I mean, this is one of the things in which I differ from Presbyterianism and a whole lot of that tradition. I don't think that we're distinct from the rest of life at all. And I think that if we damage the rest of life enough, we're damaging ourselves, and, you know, we'll pay for it.
You think we're continuing down that path?
Oh, I certainly do. I think that we can only think of it in terms of our own economic advantage, and this is deadly. The human population reached 1 billion in 1813. It's now somewhere around 9 and heading for 11, and that's only in 200 years. Now, what does that mean? That means you've got your foot on the accelerator as hard as you can, and you're heading straight for a stone wall. I mean, you can't have the first law of thermodynamics, I believe, says that you can't have an infinite amount of material in a finite space. You know, something's going to happen. It's going to explode, and I think that that's why everything seems to be speeding up, and there's more and more conflict. I mean, look, all around the world now, people are at war with each other, and I think that every effort in that direction is a hopeful sign. Every act of kindness and of, you know, simple goodwill toward any living thing is a good thing. I don't think there's ever enough of it. And I don't think we can ever learn too much about it. We never do quite enough of it, and we all feel that, don't we? You know, that we're never quite, you know, we're never quite nice enough to our parents or to our friends, or we always forget all those things. Yeah, I think that's all true. And it seems sort of so simple-minded that it's hardly worth saying, but it must, we obviously ought to think about it more often.
For something so simple, it certainly doesn't happen enough, as you say.
No.
Well, would you do us the favor and the pleasure of reading some of your poetry?
Sure. Well, the last book, I think, is probably is the best place to choose them from. That's The Shadow of Sirius.
Pulitzer Prize winning book?
That's the one. Sirius, you know, is the dog star, and it's the brightest star in the visible sky, in the visible humanity. And there are lots of stories about Sirius. The middle section of the book is a series of little elegies, and they're all poems to do with dogs, which is not very common. So let me read a poem. This was about a really great dog, black dog, who was blind, and we used to walk every day together. And it's called By Dark. When it is time, I follow the black dog into the darkness that is the mind of day. I can see nothing there but the black dog, the dog I know, going ahead of me, not looking back. Oh, it is the black dog I trust now in my time, after the years when I had all the truth, all the trust of the black dog, through an age of brightness and through shadow, on into the blindness of the black dog, where the rooms of the dark were already known, and had no fear in them for the black dog, leading me carefully up the blind stairs. She was a creature who was never afraid of anything. That was a wonderful thing about her. There was a real nobility to her, you know?
W.S. Merwin and his wife Paula live surrounded by hundreds of species of palm trees that they planted and maintain. The poet rarely ventures far from his sanctuary on Maui. Mahalo to two-time Pulitzer Prize winner W.S. Merwin, and to you for joining me on Long Story Short. I'm Leslie Wilcox of PBS Hawaii. Ahui ho kako.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox is produced in HD by PBS Hawaii with Sony technology. High definition. It's in Sony's DNA.
This is a poem to my wife called To Paula in Late Spring. Let me imagine that we will come again when we want to, and it will be spring. We will be no older than we ever were. The worn griefs will have eased like the early cloud through which the morning slowly comes to itself. And the ancient defenses against the dead will be done with and left to the dead at last. The light will be as it is now in the garden that we have made here these years together of our long evenings and astonishment.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Good.
That
I'm
was
glad you
wonderful.
liked that.